1945, Columbus, Ohio. "Enough with all this, Sydney. Get your sister and get ready for bed," the young mother hollered at her children. The girls stood at the stairwell for a moment, their heads hanging low. The youngest slowly started up the steps. Sydney wanted to follow her. She wanted to forget it all and just call it a night, but she couldn't. There was something that was eating at her very soul. It was something that had her so scared that she couldn't sleep, and she couldn't eat. All she could do was think about that moment when the dress burst into flames. That's how she described it, as if it just happened, not as if it were started. "I didn't do it, Mama," Sydney said softly. The younger mother slapped her hands down on the black burn marks of the dress. Her head hung down to the smoky fabric, and she just softly let out, "Bed, Sydney. I will not say it again." Sydney's eyes came up from the ground and just watched her mother standing there in the middle of the living room. She sighed and turned towards the stairs. Her stomps could be heard throughout the house. Her sister Nancy sat in the middle of the bed looking down at her hands. She didn't look up at her sister, she just stared. Sydney's hands came into Nancy's view. She took hold of her sister's. "It must have been the fireplace," Sydney said to Nancy, causing her sister to look up from her hands. "You don't believe that," Nancy said. Sydney sat on the bed next to her little sister. She let the statement run through her mind, and then she stood up and started getting ready for bed. "I have to," she said, as she pulled at the covers and dropped down into the pillows on the left side. Her sister was still sitting up, looking at her hands for a few moments before she fell back into the pillows next to her Sydney. "It wasn't the fireplace, Sydney," Nancy said as she started to turn over on her side. She pulled the sheet up to her neck. "It wasn't the fireplace at all," she said, and like that, she was asleep. Sydney looked over at her little sister. She hated and loved her skill of falling asleep at the drop of a hat. She was free from all of the worries of the world, if only for a few hours. She was free, and Sydney was trapped in her thoughts. It wasn't the fireplace. She knew that. They were too far away from it for it to be caused by that. She knew just what it was that caused the flames. She remembered looking at it and hating it. Not the dress, but the idea behind it. She made pretty things for selfish girls and nothing for the two that lived in her home. She was angry at her mother and at her life, and then the flames came. Sydney shook her head and just rolled over onto her side. "It couldn't have been me," she said, softly into the night. Moments after those words left her lips, she could hear shouting from downstairs. "I didn't mean to, Sue. It just came out." A man's voice came flying up the steps. It was filled with panic and pain. It only took a moment for Sydney to place the voice with a face. It was her father, a drunken man who happened to share her last name. Mr. Wilson was always away from his home. But then again, Sydney's mother always called the bar his home. If that's the case, then he never leaves home. He had many jobs throughout his life, but never really had a skill that seemed to shine. Well, that's not fully true. He had one, but he always seemed to show up at the wrong time. "It just came out! It just came out! It just came out, Frank!" Sue screamed at her forgotten husband, and then the sound pulled Nancy from her sleep. She spun from side to side trying to get a hold of her surroundings, and when she turned towards Sydney, she felt a finger on her lips. The two girls sat there in the dark and listened to the tears and the screams from the floor below. "You come and go as you please. You take every dime that I make and toss it into a bottle, and yet you think that you have the right to talk about my kids and to just toss their names around at some fleabag bar?" Frank stood still, shaking his head slowly. He cleared the tear off his cheek and bit down on his lip before speaking. "I was drunk, Sue." Sue laughed and nodded. "I put that together as soon as you came through the door," she said. Her husband grabbed a hold of her hand. "I don't know why I said it. I just wanted to feel like I knew her. Everyone was going on about their kids. I knew our Sid was better than the rest of their kids." Sue pulled her hand away. "You could have told them she's skilled at making dresses. She's an amazing little dancer. No, you decided to tell them she's fucking Power Girl." Sue screamed it, and Nancy's eyes went towards Sydney. "What's a Power Girl?" she asked her sister. Sydney didn't really have an answer for that. All she knew was now she was a Power Girl. She stood up off the bed and started towards the door. "How much time does she have?" Sue asked, and watched as her husband tried to move around the question by walking towards the burned dress. His fingers went into it and he sighed. "She's burning things again, huh?" Sue's eyes went wide. "You son of a bitch!" They're here, aren't they? Sue said those words softly and watched as her husband's eyes locked with hers. She ran towards the stairs, but he screamed out, "It's better this way, Sue! We can't take care of them! We don't even know what they are!" Sue turned around slowly. She looked at her husband, the rage building up inside of her. She started walking towards him, and with every step she took, the room started to get colder. She wasn't shocked that Frank would do something like this. In all her years of knowing him, she knew he wasn't worth her time. What shocked her is how openly he could speak about their children, as if she didn't care for them daily, as if she didn't love them deeply, as if she was just a copy of him, weak and useless. Frank could feel the air around him slowly starting to lose the heat. What they are, you worthless excuse of a man, are my girls! As the words left her lips, the room started to ice off. The girls could feel the cold as it made its way up the steps. Sydney went to open the door and could feel the chill on the doorknob. She pulled it open to see ice all along the steps. She moved forward when she heard the front door burst open. Men in black armor came rushing into the room. Frank stood there in the corner with his back towards the wall. He pointed at Sue. "She's one of them. The hell are you waiting for?" he screamed. Sue just looked at his finger pointed across towards her and she smiled. "You always were a sad little man, Frank." She said those words as blue light started to form around her hands. She kept them at her sides, and then she smiled as she turned to gaze towards the men. "Well, boys, who wants to dance first?" she said with a smile. Just then, ice started forming under Sydney's feet, causing her to slip, and she came rolling down the steps. Sue turned to see her children down on her knees. "Sydney, get up the stairs!" She screamed the words, but before she could turn her head back around, she felt a pain rush through her chest. She didn't know what it was. It was hot like fire and quickly running throughout her whole rib cage. She only felt it, but Sydney saw and heard it. It was a blast that shook through her eardrums and into her soul. She watched her mother's eyes slowly move down to the bloody hole that was forming in her chest. Sydney looked at her for a moment, then let out a chilling scream. "Mama!" "Hold your fire, you clowns. They want them alive," one of the armored men said. The men started moving forward, but Sue spun around quickly. Her hands shot forward and the blue light took over the room. "Run!" Sue yelled, and Sydney took off. She didn't even stop to see the frozen face of her father and the two armored men that stood before her mother. She just ran the best she could up the ice steps, making her way to her bedroom. The gunshots continued behind her, and she slammed the door and rested her head on it. "Sydney, what's going on?" Nancy said, and Sydney looked at her little sister and rushed over to her. She grabbed a hold of her and shook her firmly. "Nancy, you need to hide. You have to hide, Nancy." Sydney's voice had a great tone of fear in it, but Nancy just pulled out of her hold. "Where's Mama?" she screamed at her sister. Sydney shook her head once again and pulled her in close. "Nancy, there's no time. You need to hide," she yelled. Nancy was about to ask where her mother was again, but was cut off by another voice outside of the door. "This is Hunter 1. We've lost 30 and 42. Also, Mr. Wilson. 1 unidentified power girl has been terminated. 1 in the process of being tagged." The two girls looked at the door and then slowly at each other. Nancy took off towards the closet while Sydney stood in front of the bed. "Sydney, in here!" Nancy called out to her sister softly. Sydney looked over at her sister, whose face was peeping at her through the crack. "Hide," she said in the loudest whisper that she could make. The bedroom door came open and the hunters slowly started making their way around the room. Their rifles were drawn and they took slow steps as Sydney just stood there. "Sydney? Sydney Wilson?" One of the men spoke out to her as he started making his way towards her. "We've heard a lot about you from your father. We're here to help you," the hunter said as he slowly started putting his rifle down. His hand went out towards her and it got closer to her cheek and her eyes locked with his. "Be careful, Number 1. We don't know what she can do," the other hunter said behind him. Number 1's head turned towards the men, then back at Sydney, who was smiling now. "Daddy didn't tell you what I can do," she said softly. "Well, that's just like him." The room started to heat up. The men could feel it under all their armor and they were starting to sweat. "He was always the type to leave the bigger parts of the story out." As she spoke, the curtains and the bedsheets started to smoke. "So let me fill you in," she said, and as she did, the curtains burst into flames. The men started to back up. "Put her down!" one of the hunters screamed. Number 1 put his hand up and shook his head. "Nope! No one kills her. We need her alive, or this would have all been for nothing. Take her down," he said as she looked back at his men. "But no kill shots!" With those words, Sydney's eyes went wide. Then she swung her arms and the flames started to fill the room. Nancy stood there sweating in the closet. She could see it all happening. The flames dancing around the room, following her sister's every movement like some kind of sinful dance partner. She watched as some of the men ran into the flames and started screaming as they fell back down the steps. They stormed her sister, rushing her all at once and pinning her down to the bed. The flames shot up to the ceiling, the whole house ablaze, and Number 1 could see that it was not going to hold up much longer. He turned his rifle around and with one quick motion slammed the butt of the rifle into Sydney's head. The girl was out, but the flames still grew. "Pick her up and let's get the hell out of here!" he screamed. One of the men tossed Sydney over his shoulder and they all went rushing through the flames. The house was filling up with smoke. Nancy watched as they ran from the room, and she tried her best to hold in the coughs that were fighting their way out of her lungs. She couldn't do it anymore. She pushed the closet door open and fell into the bedroom. The flames were going around her, and yet none of them were coming towards her. She could feel the heat, but it was as if the fire were aware of where she was. She started coughing and racing down the steps, her bare feet slapping along the wet floor before she came to a cold stop. Her eyes locked on the young, brown-haired beauty that she had called her mother. She was just laying there in a pool of blood. "Mama," she said softly as she started walking towards her. She dropped down to her knees and picked up her mother's head, placing it into her lap. "Mama!" she screamed. The steps behind her started filling up with flames, and she turned to watch them racing towards her. She stood up with tears in her eyes and started running towards the doorway. The fire seemed to be chasing her out of the house. It was overtaking everything, but seemed to always be one good moment behind her. She burst through the doorway and was out on the green grass in the moonlight, her head turned to see her mother overtaken by the flames. The tears filled her eyes just as she started to look around for her sister, but there was no sign of anything that she once loved. "Sydney!" she screamed, and she screamed, and she screamed as the walls that she once called a home started to fall down behind her, the flames quickly fading out as the rub created smoke and dust through the night air. "Sydney!" she screamed and kept screaming throughout the moonlight. That was And From the Ashes We Rise, The Scare 1 by Sylvester Barzey. If you would like to see more by Sylvester Barzey, you can visit him at www.sylvesterbarzey.com, link below in the comments section. This has been another Unraveling with the Bone Collector. Stay spooky, kids.